Hi, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or even good night, depending on where you are. I'm Neil from Tapestry Works, and I'm going to be talking today with Mike. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Neil. Welcome to everybody. And again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening.
And we want to share with you how to deliver value rather than reams of data from your research. And in fact, this is a presentation we gave 8 years ago for NewMR. And we're back again, and we're back again for two reasons, really. Firstly, because Sue and Ray at NewMR kindly let us update our data on report quality with a survey through NewMR, and I'll be sharing with you a little bit of that, but I don't want to stage their presentation too much. And the second reason will become obvious is that there's still an issue. So let's dive into what the issues are. Clients are not happy, and specifically they're not happy with research reports that are too long and lack solution focus. And these are the two things I'll be talking about. Then I'll hand over to Mike to talk about a process for creating concise and synthesized reports that will really help you improve your client satisfaction. So let's go back to the 1990s. This is some data from the Advertising Research Foundation when they asked CEOs about the usefulness of different kinds of information. And unfortunately, market research was kind of bottom of the list in terms of their perception of the usefulness of that information. And really, it seems that maybe things haven't changed, or at least haven't changed enough, because in the NewMR recent survey, and now I can now exclusively reveal at least some of the results, there still seems to be a problem. I'm going to start with, I'm going to share with you some data which focuses on the people who receive reports, so what you might say are the users, and the people who created those reports, who you might say are the writers of those reports. So let's start with the users. And they're saying that around 30% of the reports, and in fact the report, are very good or excellent. So by process of kind of quick maths, that means that 70% of those reports are not very good or excellent. Now let's compare that to what the people who created those reports and wrote those reports say. They seem to believe that 65% of the reports they create are very good or excellent. So there's a bit of a kind of gap in perceptions here. Why might that be? Let's look at a couple of verbatims from the survey, and all the quotes I'm going to share with you are paired in terms of sharing what ways was the report good, in what ways was the report poor, and they're all from the same person. So this is the same person who says, yes, this was good, but this was poor. And in this case, this user or reader report says accurate data, thorough reporting, use of charts and graphs to visualize, but the writing was overly wordy and the conclusions were not insightful. That's not good to hear. And even the people creating and writing the reports kind of know that actionability is an issue. So this is kind of definitely one of the more pithy quotes. It was readable, but it wasn't actionable. There definitely seems to be some issues around the length of reports and a lack of a solution or actionability focus. So let's talk about that a little bit more. And let me first of all hand over to Mike briefly to talk about three very common but not good examples of reports that he's seen.
Okay. There are three bad but common examples. The first is what I call the War and Peace report. This is the overly long report. We heard a verbatim about that already. My favorite example was a client that had received a 700-page report. They asked for help because they couldn't understand it. I asked the team for the executive summary because I wasn't going to read 700 pages on the plane down to help out. And they sent me a 300-page executive summary. I'll talk about in a few minutes. The executive summary is not 300 pages, it's 1 page. So overly long reports, giving everything. Second example, which I'm sure we've all seen, is the data drop report, often sent in questionnaire number format, which is all the data, and it's basically just an appendix rather than a report. Unfortunately, all too common. And the third example, and this is one there tends to be a lot of discussion on, is what I call the Agatha Christie report. I call it Agatha Christie report because Agatha Christie doesn't tell you who done it until the last page. That's what makes it fun to read a mystery. But reports should not be mysteries, and we should be giving the client the answer on the first page and not the last page. So those are 3 examples of the kind of reports that often clients complain about. Back to you, Neil.
Thanks, Mike. And I think many of you, and certainly many of those who completed the survey, have seen these 3 examples, and we'll see in the quotes here. So this first one is from someone who created or wrote the report, and they're clear that so it had good summaries, it was very actionable insights, but it was too long. The next, again, another writer of a report, even they admit that their report was boring. It met the client's stated needs, but it's boring, paint by numbers, way too long, not actionable. And then the next is kind of a reader or receiver, user of a report, but within a supply company in the NewMR chain. He's identified this issue of hiding insights, burying them within the data. So this report contained the key survey results, but tried to cram in too much info, which made it very confusing to pull out the insights and the actions. And I think this is something we've all seen. So let's hear finally from a user, an end user, a client of a report, and they kind of crystallize, I think, one of the key issues might be a lot of reports are comprehensive, but they lack insightful analysis. Or perhaps it's that they lack clarity on what the insights are because they're buried within a sea of data. So at that point, let me hand back to Mike after I've kind of, from 2005, share with you this quotation from a client, and it shows that this is a long-standing problem. As she says, many researchers are still uncomfortable with providing clear and concise recommendations. I think that's the problem in a nutshell. So over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Neil. So the third section, we want to give 2 areas that we think would make a major impact on improving client satisfaction with reports, which is to make them concise and synthesized. What do we mean by that? So synthesized is end result focused and synthesized. Concise has 4 elements. It has an elevator speech, a 1-page executive summary, a brief document of 15 to 25 pages, and a lot of stuff thrown in appendices. Let me talk about each in turn. First, to be clear, people understand what makes a good report. There's a common understanding. You can see here whether you are receiving reports or you're writing them. And we asked people what was most important, right? Insightful, concise, and practical were the top 3. There's slightly different order if you look between concise and practical, but for all intents and purposes, people are saying they want insight, they want it to be practical, and they want it to be concise. How do we do that? And this is also the verbatims, right? It's visually appealing, and we've seen that in a couple of the verbatims, which is visually it looks better, but it doesn't have clear recommendations. It doesn't relate to the business objectives. Note, interesting here, they said it met the research objectives, and I'm sure we'll have some Q&A about setting the right research objectives. Writers know this too, right? I did great charting, the great infographics, but there was too much detail and not enough insight. So one of my favorite quotes is from Ted Levitt at Harvard. And he says, focus on outputs, not inputs. That's not actually what he said. What he said is people don't want to buy a quarter-inch drill. They want a quarter-inch hole. And people in market research tend to forget this or haven't learned it in the first place, which is we love to wax eloquently about our methodology and our techniques and our sample size when the client is saying, particularly at the report stage, I already bought all that. I commissioned you to do this work. Just give me the hole. Give me the answer, right? And we need to remember that when we create our reports. How do we create reports that focus on the outputs? We start with synthesis. So here's a simple example of synthesis versus summary, and too often what we see is summaries, not synthesis, even up front. 3 facts: I broke my knee, a burglar knocked in my car window, I got a speeding ticket. A summary simply restates them with fewer words. A synthesis says, what does it mean? And basically, I've been living dangerously, I've been where I shouldn't be. That's what it means when I have those 3 facts. An example that's more telling comes from Nora Ephron in the book Make It Stick by Chip and Dan Heath. And she shares the example when she was learning how to write headlines, because headlines are a synthesis of the story. And the class assignment was to write the headline for a story for a high school newspaper. And the facts of the matter were that the school had won an outstanding teaching award. The principal was going to the state capitol to receive the award, and it was so prestigious that the teachers were going to accompany the principal to see him receive this award. And the task is to write the headline, to synthesize. And the headlines that come back from the students, as Nora relates the story, is school wins award, principal to receive award, teachers to see the principal receiving the award, which became increasingly wordy. When in fact, that's not the headline, that's not synthesis. If you're a high school student and the principal and the teachers are going to the state capitol, the headline was, no school tomorrow. That's relevant to the audience, that's what it means to them. So I like that as an example for synthesis. Now, once you've synthesized, how do you communicate that? And one of the things I found is that often the research creator or the output creator has a good story, but they don't express it in a way that the receiver understands it. And so the receiver says, I have not got enough insight, when in fact they haven't understood the insight. So you start with an elevator speech. This is something I learned the first week on the job at McKinsey, which is if you see the client and you're in the elevator and you have 30 to 60 seconds, you tell them either here's what our hypothesis is, if you're in the early stages, or here's what the answer is. You can't obviously say the whole thing in 30 seconds. And by the way, you don't get to use charts in an elevator either. But what you do is you get to the highest level synthesis that you have, and you start with the elevator speech. And you don't try and get everything in, because what you want at the end of an elevator speech is someone saying, hey, tell me more. Let's step out and tell me more, or tell me more at the meeting next week. Synthesis is to whet someone's appetite by giving them the top line, giving them the whole to go back to. One of my favorite elevator speeches came from Simon Duval Kiefer. We were working together in Korea, and he related this story. He had done about 90-page report on a new product test, and he was all ready to present it, and the client stuck his head in and said, this is really important. I really want to know what you found, but I have an important meeting to go to, and I can't attend the presentation. So tell me, Simon, what did you find? And Simon looked at him and said, launch, a one-word elevator speech. Right. Now, new product tests are easier to get to that synthesis because it usually is launch, fix something, and then launch it or kill it. But here's an example where he didn't tell him about the contents of the report. He gave him the implication. An elevator speech then gets followed with your executive summary. An executive summary is 1 page, not 300 pages, as you heard me talk earlier, and not 5 or 10 pages. And it's really hard to write 1 page instead of 10 pages. It's easy to throw everything down on 10 pages, but you work on it. Anybody who's worked with me knows that I work really hard with them to synthesize things down to 1 page. It starts with your elevator speech because that's your top level answer. And what's added in an executive summary are the 2 to 5 key reasons why. Not the whole explanation, but 2, 3, 4, or 5 things that support your conclusion. Now, executive summary is then followed by a short, in this case, I'll show you a 20-page example. So you start with your executive summary. That's page 1. Right? You tell people up front. This is the opposite of the Agatha Christie report. You give people the answer up front. And if you need to, you give them back. Then you get to your first point. So you've got 3 points, A, B, and C. You have your first point. You synthesize that first point. And then you have 2, 3, or 4 charts which explain that point, which means these charts have to work really hard. They're not simply tabulating one question because they have to support briefly, but with synthesis, your conclusion for point A. Then you move on to point B, the 3 charts for point B. Then you move on to point C, the 3 charts for point C. Now, often someone says, but there's this great finding. It has nothing to do with the reason that the client commissioned the research. It's just so fantastic, it will solve world hunger. We must put it in the report. The worst thing you can do is try and jam it into A, B, and C where it doesn't really fit. So I will often have something called other findings, and this is where we stick those essentially irrelevant findings. And another word for other findings is stuff you don't really need to read in the report. But when someone insists on putting in there, don't ruin your flow in A, B, and C, put it in other findings. Then we do a conclusion and next steps. And then we have lots and lots of appendices. And this is where you can put all your charts that nobody really wants to see, but they might look at for backup. So this is a 20-page report. Now, maybe it's 15 pages if you've got a couple of killer charts. Maybe it's 25 pages, a few more. But this is a concise report. And I will tell you that when clients see this, often they don't, if you tell them they want a 20-page report, they say, well, we want more and more, and put the stuff in. But when you show them the report and it's got the right 20 pages, you get much higher client satisfaction. This structure is called the pyramid principle. There's a great book by Barbara Minto, which shares this. This is basically taught to people at consulting firms and other places where people write business reports of how do you take a lot of data and convey it concisely. We'll end with one more finding from the survey. And we had a mixed view looking at this. So 40% of people are saying they're getting better and 60% saying they're the same, only a few people saying they're worse. The report creators are a bit more optimistic. Neil and I were discussing this, and we're not sure if this is, the green is due to better graphics, because we saw lots of comments earlier on graphics, versus what people want but they're not finding, which is those concise, synthesized findings. So there is a mixed picture about, are we getting better? And as Neil mentioned earlier, this is not a new topic. We've been talking about it for a long time. So clients aren't happy. They tell us reports are too long, and they don't give them the answer to the marketing issue that led them to hire us, to hire you to do the report. We think a large part of the solution is conciseness and synthesized reports. With that, we thank you very much, and let's move over to questions.